Welcome. My name is Dr. Martinez, and we're going to continue the conversation that we started prior. This is my friend, Ed Buck, a social worker of many years. He's my mentor, teacher, and inspiration in the field of mental health. We had talked about social ecology and how that impacts our life and the relevance of and the importance of continuing to reflect on that. But now we're going to talk about psychology. When I talk about psychology, I think about how people think and feel about themselves and how people think and feel about the world around them because our attitude means everything in life. Welcome, Ed, and what have you got to say about that?
I think obviously what I have to say about it is that psychology is very important. It's very relevant to our lives, and matter of fact, relevant to every moment of our lives. In that, we learn by the people, a lot smarter than me. Erikson talked about the stages that people go through. I mean, basically what he did is in psychology, the father of psychology was Freud, who basically had stages of development that by the time you were 5 years old, you had kind of gone through them all. Where Erikson came along and said, no, it goes across the span of life. And I've come to see that in many ways that's very relevant.
Hmm?
So, for example, when you look at the stage for a teenager, would be what's known as identity versus role confusion. Throughout my life, any adolescent that I worked with or saw always had aspects of that question of who am I was always a very, very important thing to them in what they're trying to work out. In troubled teenagers that had, very deep and hard struggles were ones that were in many ways role confused. And the stage after that, in young adulthood, is what he called intimacy versus isolation. And to this day, every young adult I see, those are the issues. Those just not only issues of romance, but acquisition, career choice, finishing college, all the kinds of business that people of that age are dealing with. And so, for people after that, the stage in the 30s to the 60s is called generativity versus stagnation. And so what are you creating at that point? For some people, it's they're starting their families, they're generating, they're advancing in careers. And so the opposite, stagnation, if you get stuck and you don't move or you don't get help, that phase of life that goes from the 30s to the 60s, 3 decades can be a long time to be stagnated. For senior citizens, I see integrity versus despair. Most of the complaints of so many of our seniors have to do with, I wish I could have done this different. I feel bad about this. That they're dealing with issues of despair. So the relevance of psychology is its importance about understanding, what takes place through the journey of life. And so I think it's a very, very necessary thing to be conscious of, to be dealing with. And when I teach interns or young students that are going to be clinicians, that you need to be conscious of where are people at when, who are they, and what business comes at what time in life.
That's great. If we could, let's take a few moments to take them each individually. As a teenager, thinking about identity versus role confusion, I oftentimes encourage the teenagers that I see in clinical practice to make sure that they have as many friends as they can. And if they can be part of different friend groups, that's even better because they're getting the opportunity to get exposed to how different groups think. And as they're trying to figure themselves out, they can do that in the context of the experiences that they're having. Of course, I tell individuals everybody's going to mature to become an adult by having secrets. But I tell young people to be careful because the bigger your secrets, likely the bigger your problems.
Yeah, and when you look at that particular group, of course, it's a group throughout my career I've always enjoyed working with. And the reason being, I mean, some of the features of that I love about teenagers, adolescents is they operate at almost 100% affective. If you ask a teenager, who's your favorite teacher? And they would say, for example, well, Mr. Martinez, they wouldn't necessarily say, well, his grasp of psychology is so profound, so complex. No, they say, I like him because he cares. They go there. And so when we understand that in that time of figuring out who they are, that they are operating at a high capacity of affective ways of seeing things, we older generation become more and more cognitive. And so the challenge is in understanding that the two things may not necessarily compute. So how do we adapt to that? So for example, a standard question I will ask every teenager that I see is always, what are your dreams? And for the most part, the majority of kids that I've seen and see always have some dreams. And when they don't, then I say, well, that is something we need to focus on. It's an issue of concern because your feet are on this earth to accomplish something. And so we need to really become curious about that. But I more or less move in kind of that affect and try to tap into that because that's where they live, so to speak. That's whom they are. And that's what matters to them. And so it's very important to kind of, see if you can help them. And I think it's important for them to be able to say what they're dreaming of, no matter what it is. And I think we have to be careful as adults. When I have some kid that comes in who maybe has a hard time passing courses, says they want to be a rocket scientist, you have to be careful not to say, well, that's impossible because of your poor grades. I think that we have to encourage kids to dream, and they'll navigate and negotiate where they end up. We can't discourage them.
That's great. It reminds me of how you and I met many years ago.
Yeah.
I was doing my final training in hopes of becoming a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And so the project that I had was to do research on adolescent emotional health because Anna Freud, who is a psychiatrist, daughter of Sigmund Freud, had come up with a theory of Sturmendrang, a German term for emotional turmoil. And so she was postulating that adolescence includes emotional turmoil. My mentor and teacher, Dr. Daniel Offer, was dispelling that theory that, in fact, adolescence is a very normal stage in life, that adolescents have emotional issues just like everybody else does. And so that's how I reached out to you. One of the things that's very important to me is the idea to encourage individuals to figure out what they're thinking and then to help them reflect on where are their emotions coming from. So I always encourage journaling as a good method for getting closer to what's going on inside.
Yeah. Excuse me. I think journaling, again, is a commodity that we've lost track of that we need. And I think my advice to most practitioners would to encourage anybody they see to journal. But the other thing that I think is significant about adolescence, that we adults need to know how they see the world. See, the mistake we've made, I think, a lot with young people is that we've taught them that school and education is about consuming, and that rather than the fact that education is about opportunity. There are certain countries in the world that people get educated so that they can save their village or they can have a role to play with humanity. In America, it has become kind of a very consumeristic. What college are you going to? What are you? And it's all about acquisition more so than mission. And I think that we adults need to remember that we need to know the experience of young people. We need to be curious about how they see things because that input is significant to the overall input of deeper and greater understanding. I want to know how a 17-year-old sees his or her world,
Mhm.
from that perspective. And it's not always about telling them how it should be. I think that we need to promote youth leadership, and have them feel competent, appropriately competent. They can't do everything. They don't have the means to do as much as adults do, but they can, in fact, do a lot of things. They can stand for causes. They can care about things. They can look at the world and have an opinion about it, which I think is really important. And quite frankly, I think we are less curious about that now. And we need to be more curious about how we help our young people tune in. So, for example, when I ask adults, do you know who your kids' heroes are? Who are the heroes of young people today? I can tell you in my era, but that doesn't matter to them now. And so what's important? Who are they looking at? Who do they admire?
I think we're overly busy these days, and we're not checking in on one another. And I think that's one of the perils of parents in parenting, that there's a big disconnect between parents and their kids.
Again, I agree. I think that parenting is the main job of parenting is to produce productive young people that go into the world and become productive adults. And I think that we have to acknowledge that in parenting is still one of the few hierarchical. When we talk about parental discipline, the word discipline comes from the word disciple, to follow a teacher. It is not meant to be punitive, but really to raise one's self-esteem in an appropriate way. And I think that the best thing we can do in particular for adolescents, is to help them understand that their actions create consequences. And the way we help teach that lesson is that sometimes we have to impose consequences. We know in the world there's natural consequences.
Can't remember the name of a book, but I did read a book by an economist. If your children grow up to be big problems in life, it's your fault. Which begs the question, the issue of parenting and how being healthy can really impact the trajectory of kids. By that, your thoughts on being overly permissive, parents who are authoritarian in the middle, or parents who are authoritative. So the authoritarian parent is the one that's not accept demanding, the permissive, and then the authoritative, which is trying to find that balance between allowing kids to explore for themselves and yet setting the appropriate guardrails.
Yeah, and that's where we want to be, right? I mean, if parenting was a continuum, okay, and on this end was rigid parenting, this end was permissive parenting, what happened? Rigid parenting tends to be stifle kids, keeps them from being creative. Permissive parenting runs the risk of kids feeling unloved. And I think there was some research that kind of demonstrated, for example, for teen suicides, happen more in permissive situations than in anything. So where do we want to be? We want to be executing appropriate authority and with a balance. I think that's really important. My own take is kind of a psychology guy as a clinician. These teenagers and young adults that are doing donuts in intersections and that are out having these flash mobs. It's behavior that to me is demonstrating because young people will tell us through their actions what they need. They don't necessarily going to articulate and say, I need more structure. Mm-hmm. We look at the behavior and say, this is something that needs more structure. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of debate in the adult communities in politics and law enforcement about what to do about it. But I do think that behavior is telling us something, and we have to listen to it and say, what does it mean when some behavior like that is happening? And partly, I would say that as an adult, it's telling us that the kids are communicating that they need more direction and structure. Yeah, they need more recreation. They need more vocational stuff. All that is really important. But they need to to be on the other end of appropriate authority, where somebody can say to them, no, you can't do this. This can't happen. And so that they have the opportunity to abide by it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the term, Erikson terms, identity versus role confusion. Could it be that these kids in the middle of downtown Chicago doing donuts, encircled by a mob. Could be these kids who are really reacting to society trying to impose some limits on them, which is really indicative of something much larger. Because I have so many parents who don't know what to do, and the parents say, "Well, my kid just sees me as an equal," where my kid is not respecting any of my rules. And in fact, what's happening is that we're no longer the parent telling the kid. Now kids are equalized, and if we're not careful, or we take in mind these kids doing donuts in the middle of the street, it's the kids now trying to tell the parents and trying to tell society we're going to do whatever we want, and that is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, indeed, and I agree. I think that the generations of adults have to own that. I mean, I'm older than you. I came from a paradigm of parenting that was seen very hierarchically, parent, child. And I think what's happened is it's parent, child, or in some cases, child, parent. And so I think that you have to remember that the family life and parenting is a very hierarchical. It's not meant to be punitive, but it's to say the parents or the adults who have had their feet on this earth longer
Mm-hmm.
have a greater knowledge and experience about guide. And the other thing is that it's partly normal. So for adolescents, as they explore identity versus role confusion test, they're testing. The other thing that teenagers are very good at is they understand the difference between overt and covert. If I'm your parent and I tell you, okay, you're a big guy now, you need to be responsible for, so that's very overt. I state that's the rule from now on. But if what you know is covertly, I just can't stand it. And so if you just let things compost up there, I'll get so frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
So in a situation like that, what they know is that where there's two rules, one is covert and is overt. The
Mm-hmm.
one that's operationalized will be, kids used to say to me all the time, I came home late this weekend and my parents were really mad, and so they grounded me for 2 weeks, but they always kind of weaken after 3 days and let me out. See, that's a kid who's already figured out covertly what's going on. And so that kid knows the covert rule is the rule that will always be the predominant rule. As adults, we're called into having to be consistent with what we do. And so, like in practice, if I'm working with a family and parents come in and they say, well, I was so mad when this kid came home, I grounded him for 2 weeks. I can't do that. I go, look, the important thing is you stay in the role of management. So what you do is you sit your son or your daughter down and you say, I know I said 2 weeks and you've been home for 4 days now. You've done a good job, and I know that we've talked about what has happened. So I'm going to suspend the rest of the sentence. See, what you're still managing it, okay? There are ways out. But see, we have to help parents remember who they are and what it means to be a parent. And also remember that all of us have different roles. We have a hat that's our individual hat that deals with the business of being an individual. Kids have the hat of being a son or a daughter, a sister or a brother. And so as parents, we have to balance all those things. What do our kids, what do they look like and what do they do as individuals? What kind of sister or brother are they? What kind of daughter are they? The reason that's important is because there are correlations between the way you brother and sister and the way you're going to eventually husband and wife, And so the same with adults. I tell adults, you're individuals, but you're also a father or a mother or a husband or a wife. All of them have their, so it's really important. So for example, the danger for men is what we do. We trade the individual hat for what is it that you do. When men get depressed or they struggle, it's when they're in a social situation and somebody says, Dan, what do you do? And you can't answer the question. Guy loses his job or something. And see, that's really important to men. Women, I generally, but they understand better the who am I question. We tend to trade it for what we do. I mean, that's kind of our archetype. We're getting better and better at not doing that, but that's what we've done traditionally. Where women traditionally have been more fascinated with who am I? What am I about? They self-development, self-reflection.
Could it be that in some ways, particularly men, are having a hard time identifying about leading their children? And as a result, too much parenting is focused on trying to befriend the child to try to knock sense into the child. But the friendliness is not going to get us to where the child is. And could it be, from what I'm hearing from you, that say a single parent mom raised 4 teenage kids, kids are out there doing everything that young teenagers, and that mom needs to say, um, more than me needing you to like me, I need you to respect me.
Yeah, and I think eminently that that mother that you referred to needs to say that to herself. She needs to feel secure inside that your kids may not always like you in the moment. That's not what it's about. But what it's about is how am I raising these kids? See, parenting is not an event, it's a process. And that process takes a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing to remember is someday your kids will be husbands and wives, mothers and fathers. What is it that they'll remember? And what is it that they'll know? And where will they get that from? And, you know, there's the story. My own mother was a single parent mother. And so I was in my 30s at the time, and I happened at the time I had a braid. I had long hair, and I had long braid. And I was out with her day, taking her here and there. And at the time, she was in her early 60s. And I got her, we got home. I said, Mother, I'm going to leave. Is there anything else you need? And she looked at me and she says, yeah, I'd really like to know what the purpose of that long hair is.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me, I mean, at the time it was frustrating, but I think about it now and I think, see, what they were is all that they didn't compromise as they felt. I remember you told a story about your dad, and you said when you were a teenager, Dad, can I get an earring? And he said to you, yeah, you can get an earring, but you won't be my. And the right or wrong of it doesn't matter, the severity, but the point is that they had a point of view and they didn't compromise or relinquish that view. They stayed on it. And then, so what we had to do is navigate to decide.
Mm-hmm.
And I think ultimately what that gave us was clarity. And see, the other thing for the mistake, when I have people that are 45 years old and they're complaining about their parents, have a great deal of patience for understanding. I always say, what have you been doing for the last 20 something years? See, the thing is that nobody's parents are perfect. And all of us probably deserve something that we didn't get. But the beauty of adulthood is we can give ourselves those things we missed out on, we were entitled. But it doesn't take away. There's a greater danger in parenting, to your point, where we're just buddies or friends. I think that takes away from the fact that parent is compromising some of they may have over their son.
Hey, you stirred something special in me. We're not passing judgment on anybody. We're not here to tell anybody what to do or how to live. But yeah, I was 16 and I came home and I told my dad I'd like a earring. And he says, go ahead, put it on. But that's the last day you're my son, and that's the last day you can come into my house. Oh, God. That threw me off. Yeah.
Thanks.
Having those solid guardrails with which I had to abide by somebody who was leading me and it was an authority over me.
And it didn't matter that, maybe you could look back on it and say, gee, that was really tough. You don't have to be injured by those things. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes in point of view, in their various points of view. But the point is that I look at now is that we were always clear that we knew where we stood. Mm-hmm. The other converse part of that for me is that, I played Little League Baseball. And I could probably count on one hand the time that any of my parents came out to watch. I felt no deprivation about that. In fact, I think we saw that to our advantage, that it was a time we could break away from our parents and have our own lives. I think nowadays parents are much more involved in going to the sporting events of their kids. They just about attend every game, generally speaking. And it gets a nice thing, but at the same time, when we had these pickup games where, we would stop the game where we'd argue whether a call was safe or out or whatever, we had to resolve those things and then go back to play.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a correlation between that and then what we did in adulthood. We were clearer about things versus a lot of kids today, an adult steps in and makes those calls. And then I have so many kids I see now where they're just not sure what they want to do.
Wow. So maybe that's the message for today is do we know where we stand? Can we work to help our children figure out where they stand so that when they get challenged by life, they can make a decision that is in line with who they hope to be when they grow. How wonderful. That's psychology.
Where they stand has to do with where we stand. Do we know where we stand? And that's where it begins.
Mm-hmm. How about more something you can tell me about intimacy versus isolation?
Well, I think it's the time and it's the beginning, and we could do a whole thing on this, but it's young adulthood is so significant because it's the moment when, for some people, they're coming out of college. For others, they're beginning a career. But it is that time of life where it's the next move of social order. You've built on the fact that I've asked myself, who am I as a teenager? I have a sense of what that is. I'm still growing with it, but now I'm moving into something that entails a greater sense of intimacy because dreams are starting to become into reality. I mean, maybe I've now started working at the company I always want to work at. Might be a baseline job, but I'm at the beginning of something. We're engaging in a new way, in a more sophisticated adult, what's going to be our future steps. And so I think it's very significant. And those young adults that endure isolation are suffering a great deal, where they feel their friends are passing them by, or they're not progressing, or they're not sure, they're just still not sure of what it is that they want to do. And I think that we need, again, I think group work for young would be a great thing. Look at how kids date. I had a young woman say to me the other day that she doesn't know where she stands in this relationship with this man that she likes because he'll text her at night and say, 9 o'clock at night, do you want to get together? And, I'd say, well, why don't you invite him out and sit and look at him and say, where do we stand? And she looks back at me and says, yeah, I guess I could do that, but that feels odd. And so what that says to me is that, again, they're navigating a world different and one that is predicated on text and messaging that is and so it feeds in this whole journey of what does intimacy mean versus isolation.
Great. So much to talk about. And certainly maybe that's where we'll start off with the next episode. But the takeaway in what you're saying for me is the idea that our world is so focused on momentary, primarily, because of all the immediate responses that we have, not only through social media, but so many other things in life, that the important thing in early adulthood really is finding commitment to something or someone, but finding something to belong to and then giving your soul is an important piece, which could be very difficult for younger people because they're so focused on the moment and age. Thank you so much for joining. If you liked this episode, please subscribe for much greater content that is coming to you in the near future. Again, this is Dr. Martinez, and thank you to our guest, Ed Buck.